The galaxy had long known the tales of the Deathworlders, a species whose homeworld was a cauldron of chaos and carnage, where the land itself seemed determined to wipe them out from the moment they took their first breath. They had adapted in ways no other species could understand. Where other races saw an inhospitable planet, the Deathworlders saw an opportunity to evolve. They became creatures of resilience and ferocity that few could match. They didn't just survive their world, they conquered it. Each generation grew stronger, each challenge faced and defeated made them more formidable than the last. Their strength was not just in their bodies or their weapons, it was in their minds, their ability to outthink predators and opponents alike. To adapt in the blink of an eye, they were warriors who had lived through 1,000 battles before they even knew what war meant. But even the Deathworlders knew that they could not stand alone forever. The galaxy was vast and filled with dangers far greater than any single species could hope to conquer alone. And so they had built a fleet that was as much a symbol of their power as it was a tool for survival. When the call for help came from the peaceful Azirians, they did not hesitate. They responded not because of a promise to aid, but because the challenge was clear. The Azirians were a race of diplomats and thinkers, not warriors. Their peaceful ways had earned them many allies across the stars and had kept them safe for centuries. But when the Tyrek Empire began its expansion into their territory, the Azirians found themselves outmatched and overrun. Their fleet was powerful, but not enough to withstand the sheer force of the Tyrek war machine. And so they sent out a distress signal, a plea for aid to anyone who would listen. The message wasn't one of fear or panic. It was one of desperation for help, a recognition that their peaceful way of life was no longer enough to protect them. And so the call went out across the stars through the networks of trade routes and communication systems, a signal that would reach the ears of many, but only one species would truly answer it. The Deathworlders. Kale stood at the helm of the flagship, the great battleship named Vengeance, its sleek obsidian hull gleaming like a predator's eyes in the dark depths of space. The crew of the fleet moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Every Deathworlder on board had been born and raised in the heat of battle, and the rhythm of war was in their bones. Each one had faced death countless times, and each one had emerged victorious. Cal's eyes scanned the star charts as the fleet prepared to make the jump into the Azirian system. He did not look to the crew or the reports. He had long since stopped worrying about the odds of survival. That was not how Deathworlders thought to them. The only question that mattered was whether the challenge was worth their time, and this challenge was worth it. The Tyrek Empire had made the mistake of underestimating the Azirians, and they had made the mistake of calling for help from the Deathworlders. Now they would face the full force of a species that knew nothing of mercy and everything about survival. They were coming, and the Tyrek Empire would learn that it was the Deathworlders who were the true predators in this galaxy. The Azirians were known for their wisdom, their ability to broker peace and solve disputes where others saw only conflict. They were diplomats and healers of the galaxy's wounds. They had spread their influence across countless worlds, creating alliances and fostering cooperation among races that would have otherwise fought to the death. Yet they were not naive. They knew that the galaxy was full of dangerous forces that did not care for peace or the balance of power in the stars. And in their quiet moments of reflection, they knew that someday they would need help. Someday they would need the warriors of the galaxy, the ones who could fight when words failed. But even the Azirians could not have known how soon that day would come when the Tyrek Empire began its relentless expansion into Azirian space. It was not with a whisper, but with a roar. The Tyreks were a brutal and unforgiving empire, a civilization that valued power above all else and cared nothing for the lives of those who stood in their way. Their military was vast, and their tactics were ruthlessly efficient. They had conquered dozens of systems with ease, and their eyes were now set on Azirian space. The Azirians fought back with all their might, but it wasn't enough. Their fleet was strong, but the Tyrek war machine was stronger, their weapons more advanced, their numbers overwhelming. The peaceful Azirians were outgunned, outmanned, and outclassed. The battle raged for months, and the Azirians watched as their worlds fell one by one to the unrelenting tide of Tyrek forces. Entire colonies were lost, entire cities reduced to ashes. The Azirian government tried to negotiate. They sent emissaries. They pleaded for peace, But the Tyrax only responded with more bloodshed, and the words of diplomacy fell on deaf ears with their backs against the wall, and their last hope slipping away. The Assyrians did what they had never wanted to do. They sent a distress signal not to their allies, not to their longtime partners, but to a species they had only heard of in stories, the Deathworlders. The tales of the Deathworlders were known across the galaxy, their name whispered in both fear and awe. It was said that they came from a world where death was a constant companion, where survival was a test of willpower and cunning, where only the strongest, the most cunning could thrive. But it was also said that when the Deathworlders answered a call for help, they would not come as friends, they would not come as allies, they would come as predators. The Assyrians knew that they were risking everything by reaching out to these legendary beings. But they also knew that if they didn't, the Tyrek Empire would destroy them. All. The signal was sent out with urgency. It didn't promise peace or kindness. It promised only that the Deathworlders would come if they chose to do so. And if they did, the Assyrians would have no choice but to accept whatever price the Deathworlders demanded for their help. But the call went out anyway, because there were no other options left. And then the galaxy waited. The Assyrians didn't know if they would ever hear back, but they had no choice but to hope that the Deathworlders would hear them and choose to answer the call for help. The silence between the stars felt endless, but they could only wait to see if the predators would come. Admiral Kale stood at the bridge of the Vengeance, his eyes fixed on the stars before him. The silence in the command center was deafening, save for the soft hum of the ship's engines and the quiet chatter of his crew. The fleet was preparing for the jump into Assyrian space, but Kale didn't need to hear the reports to know that every Deathworlder aboard was eager for what awaited them. Each one of them knew that a challenge had been set before them, a challenge they could not ignore. They had faced countless battles across the galaxy, but this one was different. This wasn't a simple war for territory or resources. This was something more personal for the Deathworlders. This was the kind of battle where survival instincts would be tested to the limits, where they would face not just an enemy, but a threat to the natural order of things. The Deathworlders had earned their reputation because of the way they had been forged by their hostile homeworld, a world where danger lurked in every shadow, and only the strongest survived. They had become the apex predators of their galaxy, and they took pride in that title. It was not arrogance, it was truth to them. Survival was not just a matter of strength. It was a matter of intelligence, adaptability, and ruthlessness. And now they were answering a call from a species they had never met, but one they respected for the challenge it represented. Kale turned his gaze to the stars. A complex web of interstellar pathways stretched across the sky, each line representing a system, a world, a life, and a story of survival. His eyes narrowed as the calculations for the jump flashed across his command panel. His mind was already in battle mode, calculating not just tactics, but the rhythms of war, how to outthink his enemies before they even knew they were being outmaneuvered, how to break them down piece by piece without wasting a single move. This was a fight for the Assyrian survival, but more than that, it was a fight for the Deathworlders' pride and their very essence of being. Kale's voice cut through the stillness of the room. "Initiate jump," he said. The order was simple, but laden with the weight of the galaxy. The fleet would not fail. The jump took mere moments, but to the crew it felt like an eternity. In that brief stretch of time, they were suspended between worlds. The tension was palpable. The Vengeance and the entire fleet felt like a beast preparing to strike its prey. When the ships emerged from hyperspace, the Assyrian system stretched before them, a vast and beautiful expanse of stars and planets. But beneath that beauty, a grim reality awaited. The Tyrek forces had already begun their assault. The Assyrian homeworld was surrounded by enemy ships, like vultures circling their prey. It was clear the Assyrians had not been able to hold their ground for long. Kale's eyes flickered to the tactical display on his console, and he knew without question that the Deathworlders were not here for diplomacy or negotiation. They were here to win, to make sure that the Tyrek Empire felt what it was like to face an enemy who had mastered the art of survival itself. The Deathworlder fleet spread out across the system, moving with a precision that was almost eerie, each ship gliding into position with deadly intent. They did not take time for speeches or formalities. They did not need to. Every crew member aboard the Vengeance knew their role and their responsibility. They were not here to play games. They were here to restore balance by force. As the fleet approached the Azirian homeworld, Kale spoke once more, his voice calm but filled with the certainty of a leader who had seen it all. Prepare for engagement. And with that, the Deathworlders entered the fight not as saviors, but as predators ready to hunt the Tyrek forces down and show them what it meant to face the apex of the galaxy's hunters. The moment the Deathworlder fleet emerged from hyperspace, the Tyrek forces froze for just an instant. A fatal mistake. In that split second, they realized what they were up against, but by then, it was too late. Kel's fleet had already taken the initiative, moving like a swarm of predators that knew precisely when and where to strike. The Deathworlders did not wait for the enemy to make the first move. They did not need to. They had spent their entire existence being the ones who made the first move, the ones who dictated the terms of battle. The Tyrek ships, with their imposing steel hulls and overwhelming firepower, were prepared for combat, but they were not prepared for the vicious efficiency of the Deathworlders. Kel's flagship, Vengeance, led the charge, cutting through the enemy lines like a blade through paper. Their weapons fired not in bursts but in precise, deadly patterns that shattered shields and punctured hulls in one clean strike. The Tyrek warships, accustomed to their own overwhelming firepower, were caught off guard by the Deathworlders' superior tactics. The Tyrek Empire had made the mistake of thinking their numbers and technology could guarantee them victory. But they hadn't accounted for the Deathworlders' ability to adapt, to move with an efficiency that was nothing short of primal. The Deathworlder ships scattered across the battlefield, using every trick they knew to disrupt and dismantle the Tyrek forces. They moved in and out of asteroid fields, using the debris as cover to ambush the enemy. Their ships darted like animals in the wild, attacking with no pattern, no predictability, keeping the Tyreks on edge. Each Deathworlder vessel was not just a ship, it was an extension of its crew, an instrument designed for one purpose: survival. And the Tyreks, despite their technological superiority, could not keep up. Kale, watching from the bridge of Vengeance, knew that this was only the beginning. The Deathworlder fleet had come to fight with a singular purpose, not to claim territory, not to conquer, but to destroy the invaders. The Tyrek forces were like prey now, reacting to each of the Deathworlders' moves with fear and confusion. Their command ships were the first to fall, disintegrating into clouds of debris as the fleet relentlessly tore through their ranks. The Tyrek fleet's formations shattered, ships scattering in all directions, trying to escape the overwhelming ferocity of the attack. But it wasn't just the ship-to-ship combat that made the Deathworlders' assault so terrifying. It was their ground tactics. As the Deathworlder forces descended upon the Azirian planets, they dropped like shadows onto the surfaces, every soldier outfitted with the most advanced survival equipment in the galaxy. Their armor was not just for protection. It was an extension of their very essence, designed to survive the harshest conditions imaginable. They could move through environments that would choke any other species, using every scrap of the land to their advantage. Forests, deserts, mountains, they didn't just navigate these terrains. They dominated them. The Tyrek ground forces were now facing a nightmare they had never seen before. The Deathworlder soldiers didn't need to fight fair. They didn't need to engage in traditional battles. Instead, they struck from the shadows, using the very environment as their weapon. Tyrek soldiers who thought they could hold their ground found themselves outmatched by the speed and cunning of the Deathworlders. There was no mercy in their eyes, no hesitation. They were not here to negotiate, to talk, or to capture. They were here to annihilate. As Kel watched the carnage unfold, he knew the Tyrek forces were beginning to understand what it meant to face an opponent who had no limits, no weaknesses. This was not just a battle. This was a reckoning. And the Deathworlders were just getting started. The Deathworlder fleet showed no sign of slowing down, and the Tyrek forces were beginning to crumble under the relentless onslaught. Their once proud armada, filled with ships built for war, was falling apart piece by piece as the Deathworlders' tactics shredded their defensive lines. The Tyrek commanders scrambled to regroup, but their forces were already too scattered, too disorganized to mount an effective resistance. For every move they made, the Deathworlders anticipated it, countering with devastating efficiency. Kale watched from the command deck of Vengeance as the enemy fleet fractured in real time. He had expected this. The Deathworlders never fought just to win. They fought to break their enemies, to leave them with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat. He had seen it before, in countless skirmishes, in battles where the odds had seemed insurmountable. The key to their success wasn't their weapons, their ships, or their technology. It was their ability to outthink, outblast, and outmaneuver their opponents. Every Tyrek ship that fell was a testament to the Deathworlders' singular focus on survival. "We've penetrated their outer defenses," reported the tactical officer. "The Tyrek forces are in full retreat. The main command ships are down, and their fighter squads are scattered." Kale nodded without turning from the view. The Tyreks had miscalculated. They had assumed their superior firepower would win them the day. They hadn't accounted for the Deathworlders' strategy of overwhelming precision and calculated brutality. The enemy had tried to fight like a force of nature, but the Deathworlders were a force of nature, and nature had no place for weakness. "Consolidate the attack," Kale ordered. "Take out their remaining command vessels. They'll be disorganized, but we cannot let them recover." The Deathworlders were not a species that allowed their enemies to regroup, to lick their wounds, or to reconsider their decisions. No, the Tyrek Empire had made its move, and now they would feel the full weight of their mistake. As Kal's orders were transmitted, the fleet moved with surgical precision, focusing on the last remaining Tyrek ships that still posed a threat. No stray shots were fired. Each attack was calculated to disable, destroy, and eliminate any possibility of retaliation. The Deathworlder ships slashed through the remaining enemy lines, their cannons firing in rhythmic bursts that ensured nothing was left standing. The Tyrek fleet didn't have a chance. The Deathworlders were too fast, too fierce, and too relentless. Meanwhile, on the ground, the battle was taking a similar turn. The Deathworlder soldiers had already infiltrated the Tyrek-held cities on the Azirian planets. What had once been cities of peace and culture now became hunting grounds for the Deathworlder infantry. Their movements were a blur, disappearing into the shadows of buildings and alleyways, emerging to strike in perfect synchronization. Tyrek soldiers, once confident in their superiority, found themselves outmatched by the speed and brutality of their attackers. The Deathworlders didn't fight according to any rulebook. They didn't fight to preserve anything other than their survival and their dominance. From high in the sky, the Vengeance washed over the carnage. Kal's eyes were locked on the tactical display, tracking the last of the Tyrek ground forces as they scrambled to flee. Their escape routes were already blocked. Their communication lines were severed. The Deathworlders had closed every door, and now the only option was surrender or death. The Tyrek Empire, for all its technological might, was falling apart. Kale felt no satisfaction in the destruction. It was simply the way things were. The galaxy was a harsh place, where only the strongest could survive, and the Deathworlders were living proof of that. This was not a battle fought for justice or peace. This was a battle fought for survival, for the galaxy to understand that when you threatened the weak, you invited the wrath of the strongest. "Report," Kale said, his voice cold. "Remaining Tyrek ships are fleeing the system," the officer replied. "Ground forces are in full retreat. The Azirians are requesting contact." "Not yet," Kale said. "We'll let them recover first. Then we'll talk." The Deathworlders had answered the call, but their work was not done. The Azirians had been saved, yes, but the message had been sent as well. The galaxy now knew what would happen when a species like the Tyrek Empire dared to face the Deathworlders, and in the silence that followed the battle, Kal's only thought was simple: Let them remember. As the last remnants of the Tyrek fleet scattered into the vast reaches of space, the battlefields on the Azirian worlds began to quiet. The skies, once filled with the sounds of war, were now eerily still. The ground was littered with the debris of a conflict that had raged for days, but in the wake of the destruction, the Deathworlders had achieved what they set out to do: restore the balance of power and send a clear message to any who might think to challenge the galaxy's natural order. On the surface of the Azirian homeworld, the Deathworlder forces began their final sweep through the remaining Tyrek holdouts. It wasn't just about eliminating the last of the enemy's military presence. It was about ensuring that no trace of their occupation remained. The Deathworlder infantry moved through the ruins with cold precision, their footsteps silent against the scorched earth. Their armor was designed not just for protection, but for total integration with the environment. They had no need for elaborate tactics or strategies. They were a species that could read the land itself and use it as an extension of their will. Azirian civilians who had survived the Tyrek siege watched in awe as the Deathworlders made their way through the ruins. They were a sight both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Silent warriors who fought not for glory, but for the simple, brutal truth of survival. The Azirians had never known anything like them before, and they found themselves caught between gratitude and fear. The Deathworlders were saving them, yes, but they were doing it in a way that seemed entirely foreign to their peaceful culture. The Deathworlders showed no interest in the Azirian civilians. They had come to fight, not to rebuild. Their only concern was the annihilation of the Tyrek forces, and as that task neared completion, the Deathworlders began to consolidate their position, ensuring that no part of the enemy infrastructure was left to regroup. The Tyrek war machines had been dismantled with brutal efficiency, their weaponry repurposed or rendered useless. Kale stood at the helm of the Vengeance, watching the reports come in from every corner of the system. The enemy had been routed, but Kale was no fool. He knew that Tyrek would not take this defeat lightly. There would be consequences. This was not a species that easily accepted failure, but that was a concern for later. For now, the Deathworlders had completed their mission. "Admiral," the communications officer spoke, breaking the silence. "The Azirians are requesting an audience." Kel's lips twisted into a small, almost imperceptible smile. He had expected this. The Azirians had already sent their gratitude, but Kale knew that there was more to say. The Azirians would want answers. They would want to understand why the Deathworlders had come and why they had fought the way they did. But the Deathworlders weren't here for diplomacy, nor were they interested in explaining themselves. Their actions spoke louder than any words could. "We'll meet with them," Kale said flatly, his gaze never leaving the view of the war-torn planet below. "But don't expect any warm speeches or empty promises. We came to do what needed to be done. Nothing more." The communication with the Azirians was soon set up, and Kale's image flickered to life on a screen aboard the Azirian flagship. The Azirian leaders were gathered in their command center, their expressions a mixture of awe, relief, and uncertainty. They had survived, yes, but now they faced the Deathworlders, whose reputation was both a blessing and a curse. "Admiral Kale," the Azirian representative began, his voice calm but cautious. "On behalf of the Azirian coalition, we thank you for your timely intervention. You have saved our people." Kel's gaze remained steady. "You were in danger. We acted because it was necessary. Your survival was secondary to the task at hand." There was a long pause. The Azirian leader looked taken aback, but quickly regained his composure. "But surely we owe you more than just survival, the cost of this battle." "Your survival was the cost," Kale interrupted, his tone sharp. "We did what we had to, not for gratitude or reward. This is what we do. This is who we are." The Azirians exchanged uneasy glances. The Deathworlders had not come as saviors in the traditional sense. They had come because the galaxy demanded it. They had come to restore order by force, to remind the galaxy of the natural balance that the Deathworlders embodied. Kel's voice softened just a fraction. "You're alive. That's enough." With that, he ended the communication, leaving the Assyrians to digest the weight of his words. The Deathworlders had done what was required of them. They had killed, they had fought, and they had won. There was nothing more to say. As Kel watched the planet below, the message was clear. The Deathworlders would be watching, and anyone who dared to challenge the fragile piece of the galaxy would feel their wrath. The Assyrians, though grateful for their survival, were left with more questions than answers. The Deathworlders' brutal efficiency had saved them from certain extinction, but it had also left them shaken. The nature of the Deathworlders' intervention, the cold precision with which they had dismantled the Tyrek forces, had been both a relief and a terrifying reminder of the dark side of the galaxy. The Assyrians had never seen warfare like this before. Their people were diplomats, thinkers, artists, not warriors. They had relied on negotiation and compromise to ensure their place in the galactic order. But now, they were faced with the reality that there were forces in the universe far more terrifying than the Tyrek Empire. The Assyrian leadership convened in their war room, a grand chamber adorned with holograms of the galaxy. They were surrounded by the familiar displays of star maps, trade routes, and communication channels. But today, the room felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air. They had been saved, yes, but at what cost? The Deathworlders were not allies in the traditional sense. They had come to destroy, not to negotiate. Their methods were alien to everything the Assyrians had worked for. "We owe them everything," one of the Assyrian commanders said, his voice filled with admiration for the Deathworlders. "But at what cost to our own sovereignty?" Another leader, a seasoned diplomat, shook his head. "We cannot let the galaxy see us as weak. The Deathworlders may have come when we called, but what happens when they leave? Do we owe them a debt? What will they ask for in return?" The room grew quiet, the weight of their predicament settling in. They had been saved, but they didn't fully understand the price they had paid. They hadn't just invited the Deathworlders in. They had invited a force that cared little for diplomacy or alliances. The Assyrians had a history of playing the long game, of building bridges across civilizations, but the Deathworlders didn't play by those rules. On the Vengeance, Kale sat in his command chair, observing the calm of the post-battle system. His fleet had finished their sweep of the Assyrian worlds, ensuring that no Tyrek ships remained. The Assyrian people were safe, for now. But Kale knew that, in the end, this wasn't about saving one species or another. It was about the galaxy's natural order. The Deathworlders were the predators, and those who didn't respect that order would learn the hard way. He was a leader of warriors, not diplomats. His mission was not to make friends, but to ensure that the Deathworlders remained at the top of the food chain. The Tyrek Empire had learned this lesson, and now the Assyrians would too, whether they liked it or not. "Admiral," the communications officer said, breaking Kel's thoughts, "we've received a message from the Assyrians. They're requesting a meeting." Kale nodded. "Put them through." The holographic image of the Assyrian leader appeared before him, his expression calm but wary. "Admiral Kale, we thank you once more for your intervention. Our people owe you their lives." Kale didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The gratitude was understood, but it was hollow. The real question remained unspoken. What now? The Assyrian leader hesitated. "We understand the power you wield, but we must ask, what do you want in return for your help? We cannot ignore the fact that your intervention has come at a cost. We will need to find a way to repay your people for saving ours." Cal's gaze hardened, his voice as cold and direct as ever. "You don't need to repay us. We did what was necessary. The galaxy has a way of keeping balance, and you were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Your survival was a consequence of that balance. Nothing more." The Assyrian leader looked uncomfortable, but nodded. He was beginning to understand the nature of the Deathworlders. "We will honor the debt of life," he said cautiously, "but we will also need to rebuild, and we need to ensure that this never happens again. We can't afford to be defenseless. We need nothing from you," Kale interrupted, his tone hardening. "You will rebuild because you must. We don't care about your politics, your future. We do care about your survival. And that's all you need to concern yourself with." The Assyrian leader's expression faltered for a moment, but then he regained his composure. "Understood, Admiral. But we will not forget what you have done. And we will make sure that your people's strength is respected across the stars." Cal's lips curled into a brief, emotionless smile. "I don't need respect. I need you to remember what happens when the natural order is disturbed. That's all." With that, the transmission ended. Kale turned away from the screen, staring out into the vastness of space. The Assyrians would rebuild. They would learn. And when the next predator came, they would remember who had kept them alive, and why the Deathworlders were not the species to be trifled with. For now, the galaxy was quieter, but Kale knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Weeks passed since the battle for Assyrian space, and while the Assyrians rebuilt their shattered worlds, the presence of the Deathworlders lingered over them like an unspoken promise. The Vengeance and its fleet had left the system, but not without ensuring that the Tyrek Empire knew better than to return. The message had been sent, loud and clear. The Assyrians had been saved, yes, but they had been shown what it meant to owe their survival to the Deathworlders. Kale stood on the observation deck of the Vengeance, looking out at the stars, his mind wandering. He was a soldier, a tactician. He understood the ways of war, the strategies that had made the Deathworlders the apex predators of the galaxy. But the Assyrians, they were different. They had survived, but the cost of that survival would be more than just the war. It would be the long-term shift in their understanding of power, of diplomacy, of what it meant to exist in the galaxy. "We've received reports from the Assyrians," the communications officer said, breaking Kale from his thoughts. "They're stabilizing their systems, but there's still a sense of uncertainty among their leaders. They've sent a request for further assistance with rebuilding their military infrastructure." Kale's gaze hardened as he considered the request. The Assyrians had been left with no choice but to accept the reality of their vulnerability. The Deathworlders had saved them, but in doing so, they had forced the Assyrians to confront the true nature of their position in the galaxy. They could no longer rely on diplomacy alone. The Deathworlders had shown them what the galaxy could truly be, a brutal, unforgiving place where only the strongest survived. "Tell them we'll assist, but on our terms," Kale said, his voice cold and deliberate. "If they want to stand on their own 2 feet, they'll have to understand that strength is the only language that matters in this galaxy." The officer nodded, inputting the orders. As the message was transmitted, Kale couldn't help but reflect on the uneasy balance he had struck with the Assyrians. They had learned that survival required more than just the ability to negotiate. It required the ability to fight, to defend themselves, and to recognize when they were outmatched. It was a lesson the Assyrians were beginning to grasp, but how long would it take for it to truly sink in? The next few weeks saw the Vengeance and its fleet returning to Assyrian space, this time to provide military expertise and support. The Deathworlders didn't hand out weapons or technology out of kindness. No, they shared their knowledge of survival, of the ruthlessness needed to secure one's place in the galaxy. They taught the Assyrians how to fight, how to hold their ground, and above all, how to never again become prey. The Deathworlder influence was undeniable, and in many ways, it was shaping the future of the Assyrian military. In one of the training grounds, Deathworlder soldiers stood alongside Assyrian recruits, showing them how to fight not just with technology, but with instinct. They taught the Assyrians how to read the land, how to strike when the time was right, and how to recognize the predators lurking just beyond the horizon. The Assyrians, who once relied on peace treaties and alliances, were now learning the harshest truth of all. The galaxy was a jungle, and only those who adapted would survive. As Kel watched the training exercises from the bridge of the Vengeance, a part of him understood the purpose of this mission. The Deathworlders didn't just conquer. They adapted, they taught, they reshaped civilizations into something stronger. The Assyrians would learn, not out of gratitude, but out of necessity. They would become a force in their own right, no longer relying on others to defend them. And yet, as Kel watched the progress unfold, he felt a deep, almost instinctual understanding of the path the Assyrians were walking. They would grow, yes. But would they ever truly become predators, or would they always rely on the deathless shadow of the Deathworlders to remind them of the power they lacked? The Deathworlders' role in the galaxy was clear. They would remain at the top of the food chain. They were the apex, and the galaxy would always be reminded of that. When the time came, they would answer the call again, not out of mercy, but because the balance demanded it. For now, the Deathworlders would leave, but the lessons would stay, engraved in the Assyrian heart. And Kale knew that someday, when another predator arose, the Assyrians would either stand as equals or fall as prey. And if they failed, the Deathworlders would be waiting.